Welcome to Roll to Save, the RPG history podcast. Dungeons and Dragons.
Welcome to our roundtable for this, our Dungeons and Dragons episode. I have with me, as usual, Steve and Jason, my trusty co-hosts. How are you doing, guys?
Good, thanks, yeah.
Very well. Good to be here.
We also have a special guest, a world-famous games designer, no less, Mr. Corey Young. How are you, Corey?
I'm well, thanks. I'm so glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, we're very glad to have you. So, Corey, given that you're a guest, we'll ask you the same question that we asked the guys last week. What was your first experience with role-playing games? What was it that dragged you into the hobby?
I'd been in comic book stores and seen some of these games on the shelf that had dragons and beasts on them and so on. I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then that's right about the time that the Dungeons and Dragons started making the popular press because of all the bad news and so on, the trumped up bad news about it. So, therefore it was a bit more enticing. Now this was, I'll talk about years. This was 1983. It's my senior year of high school. My first thing, I picked up a used copy of Tunnels and Trolls. And the copy I had came with a bunch of cardstock pathways that you could, assemble into a dungeon and so on. That looked enough like Dungeons and Dragons for my taste. And just scoured through the rules of that. And I was intrigued. I thought that this looks like something I could really enjoy. And then I began to understand there was no internet and so on, but just from, I guess, articles in magazines that I had read, started to get the idea of how the game was played. And then a friend of mine invited me to join a group that he had been playing for a few weeks, but they were playing RuneQuest. So RuneQuest was actually the first RPG that I played, and I played that for many years. About a year and a half later, one of the other guys in the group decided he wanted to try to run D&D, and that was version 2 at that time. So it wasn't much later than that I started playing D&D.
And do you still play it nowadays, now that the 5th edition's out, or are you, because you're a proper grown-up, do you spend your time doing other things?
Well, there was a very long break in there after college and then having kids and so on. Yeah. So that's probably a pretty familiar story to a lot of people. So there was at least a decade in there where I didn't play anything for quite a while. And then got back in with D&D 3.5. And that was a good experience with a bad group or a bad premise. We can talk about that later. And then kind of faded away, moved over toward board games for quite a while, just because of time constraints. I could not commit to a regular scheduled group. So I switched over to board games for quite a while. And then when I was on the road with a company with which Iain is familiar, I started playing Pathfinder, the organized play for Pathfinder, and enjoyed that quite a bit. Skipped D&D version 4 entirely, and kind of really fell out of love with Pathfinder, and was especially the organized play. And then I started to hear about this Critical Role thing, and I watched it for a bit and saw a much cleaner, better version of Dungeons and Dragons, and it got me back in. But to be honest, I have yet to play 5. I've played around with 5 using D&D Beyond, and I'm getting ready to DM my first game of D&D 5, but I have yet to play it.
In the preparation for this, I went into Barnes & Noble and got a copy of the starter set, and it is so polished in comparison to what was released all those years ago. I mean, you've got a 32-page guide that gets you started, and if you're the DM, it's got an adventure that talks you through every single step of the way, and it's actually fairly decent. It's not some sort of throwaway thing that's written in the back of a napkin. Fifth edition certainly appears to be much more polished than what went before. What was your first experience with D&D?
Well, yeah, we just talked about it last time. So I came from kind of the wargaming, pushing like Napoleonics figures around and stuff like that, and went to this club and with like-minded nerds. And one guy brought along sort of D&D at the time. So we're talking really the original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide. So that was my first experience. I didn't get to do the red box until quite a lot after, and I didn't play that much of it, if I'm honest. The sort of basic D&D expert, and was a basic expert advanced, and then something else. There was gods or whatever.
Yeah, there was 5 of those editions. There was I think there was basic expert, companion, something else that escapes me, and then immortals for if you fancy playing
a gold book or whatever. So I got confused because I had to go back to this kind of simplified rule set. But yeah, D&D, and if we're talking years, as Corey mentioned, I'm going to trump it down to 1981.
Wow. And you've played pretty much every edition, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely every single edition. AD&D, second edition AD&D, third edition that morphed into 3.5, done the Pathfinder thing, invested in fourth edition, and I've now got 2 fifth edition groups on the go at the moment. So, yeah, all of them.
What about you, Steve? You confessed, I think that's probably the best word, last episode, that your first foray into role-playing was with MERP, which seems really masochistic. But what was your first D&D experience?
It was with the same friend who was playing MERP, and he had a dog-eared copy of AD&D second edition, the original hardback one with the paladin on the front. I kind of got a little emotional looking at pictures of it recently, doing the research for this podcast, and just flicking through that book and going, oh my goodness, there's so much to this. And then maybe slightly later on, we picked up the red box to actually play, and between the two of them, it was definitely an interesting, maybe slightly jarring experience of seeing the differences between the two sort of things, but it was good. I really liked the system, and I really liked just the content. Even like you mentioned, it was unpolished compared to today, but that's a whole nother topic.
Jason, given that you've played every edition, what's your feeling on all the changes that they've made throughout the year?
There was an awful lot of complexity in sort of the original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The advanced bit was pretty accurate. You had a specific weapon, it got a bonus against chainmail, but got minuses against leather, and it was pretty complicated and hard to run. Focused extremely heavily on stats and the ability to kill stuff. There wasn't really a skill system as such, and obviously that's kind of evolved. Second edition cleaned it up a little bit, but still was mainly in the similar sort of place. There was a few extra races, and it took away some of the conflicting stuff between the basic rules and all the add-ons like Unearthed Arcana and stuff like that. Third edition was kind of the big change. That was when sort of the D20 system, as it has kind of come to be known, like the SRD and things like that, and the basis for other games. So they got a much more streamlined system. Skills became much more of a thing, and 3.5 kind of carried that on. I guess the biggest problem with 3.5 is just the amount of stuff that came out for it. So the amount of supplements and extra worlds and different books for whether you were playing a divine character or a wizard, there was always an extra book for you. Fourth edition tried to strip that all the way back and try to appeal, to my mind, to the kind of computer generation, the kind of take a save point and reset your character. Lots of things were like at-will powers and then encounter powers and daily powers, and it was all reset when you went for a sleep. If I'm honest, I tried really hard with 4th edition, didn't really like it. I ran it for a long time for a group that I play with on a regular basis, and it just felt a little bit half-baked, I guess, is probably the answer. 5th edition, much better. In fact, I think it's definitely got the potential to be my favourite edition to date. I think previous to that, 3.5 would have got the nod, but 5th just seems a lot cleaner. It's not as complicated. There's also not the power creep as well. So instead of every level, you fight against another +1 to hit, and you keep going, and you end up with these huge bonuses. That's been kind of tailored down a bit more. So it seems more sustainable if that makes sense, over the levels.
Corey, I'd be interested in your opinion, because I kind of semi-joked at the beginning that you're a world-famous games designer, but you have actually designed and published a board game that I'll give a little shout-out to at the end, because it is fantastic. But you're very much in that space of designing rules and looking at the likes of game balance. How do you feel that the current edition looks compared to the previous ones, and what do you think has driven that transformation from the very ad hoc set of rules we saw in earlier editions to this much more streamlined edition that we see today?
It makes sense that it's become what it has. And the word that I would use is elegant. And that's a word that you'll hear people use when describing board games in board game design. It refers to clean, functional, logical. It just makes sense. It does a minimalist approach to doing something. It does it very well. Not you can have something that's too sparse. That is too open-ended. There are some games that are much more focused on just storytelling, and they basically say, yeah, you can make stats, but don't really pay attention to them. I think 5 really struck a perfect balance. And I'll tell you, the one thing that just sold me immediately on 5 was the advantage-disadvantage mechanism. That's just brilliant. That just makes all the difference. And the simplicity of, if you have advantage and disadvantage, it's a wash. And I don't care how many advantages and how many disadvantages you have, it's a wash. That is so strong, so clever. It just really set it apart. And then the paring down of the skills, getting rid of some of the exclusion things where if you don't have the skill, you can't even try it. Come on, we're a person in the world. I should be able to try things. I very much agree. Like when I looked at 4, I see what they were trying to do, trying to embrace the digital. I think that was a big mistake. Anyway, I agree with the earlier points on all of these things. My overall point was that the system matured. It's been around for, somebody tell me the years, 40 now?
Yeah, almost 50.
Yeah. It's going to have to get good at some point, right? And I agreed, those earlier rules were just scary. Anybody want to say THACO? It's so much more logical now. And I like that we don't just have this add another +2 and add another +2 and stack all these things on. I watched that get abused so terribly in Pathfinder. To me, it just became unplayable. You had to keep track of so many things. And now that's just gone. And you can focus on having your high adventure and doing your role playing and just get on with it.
One of my favorite random rules that I found when researching this, and I don't remember it from back in the day, probably because I was a child at the time, but there's a very specific rule for dragons in the 1983 edition around subduing dragons. And it says that you can declare that you're going to be hitting the dragon with the flat of your sword. And if you reduce it to 0 hit points, the dragon is not dead. And instead, it respects the fact that you could have killed it, but you haven't. And instead, you then cart the dragon around with you and you can go and sell it to someone. And it's so completely random. And
good to know. Yeah. And I would have used that so many times if I'd only known.
How to tame your dragon?
Literally. Apparently, you tame your dragon by whacking it with the flat of your sword. It's a sort of flippant point to make, but from what I've seen of 5th edition, it gets rid of all this randomness that has plagued earlier editions. Steve, you mentioned that you've got these long nostalgic pinings for, I think it was 2nd Ed AD&D. Was that your favourite edition, or do you have another one?
Actually, I may have memories about that, probably because it was my first experience with the system in the game. But honestly, if you're talking favorites, that's a really, really tough question to answer. 3rd edition is probably the one I would consider my favorite. The 5th would be a close second, if not tied. And mainly 3rd edition, mostly from nostalgia, the amount of time messing around with it, the number of books. It was the first sort of really sort of production quality level book that that I feel like we got out of the system. And, you know, I moved to the States not long after it came out. And like you said, spending time at Barnes & Noble looking through hardback books. It was the first edition I'd play with my kids. I have fond memories of the starter edition for third edition because I picked that up and played it through with my kids for the first time. I'm not going to lie, obviously, fifth edition to me is just elegant's a great word, Corey. Like, it's absolutely a more elegant. It's the first kind of edition you probably would feel like as you see it, like on a Target shelf. You probably would never have pictured seeing on a grocery store or a regular retail store. You probably would never picture seeing AD&D in there, right? It was much more niche. And now they've actually made a game with production values enough that which is still a good quality product that actually can make it and be sold at a price point in a place like the Target, which is really impressive.
Yeah, it is. It's something that I think we've all probably noticed is how mainstream it's become. Back in the 80s, you had the D&D cartoon, which I think was about as close to mainstream as it got. I remember as a child, I had some advanced Dungeons and Dragons toys. There were these weird figures that they made of various characters from D&D. I think it was at the time when TSR realised that they basically had a license to print money, so they churned out a load of random things like this. But it never really took off the way that it's taken off today. And we mentioned it last episode, with the likes of Games Workshop, which became a high street presence selling role-playing games, but that was still a specialist shop. Normal people, quote unquote, wouldn't necessarily wander in there and think, oh yeah, I'll just pick up this game. But when you've got Dungeons and Dragons on the shelves and somewhere, like Steve said, Target, and people might be roaming about and think, oh, it's in there with the board games, I might take that home and see what it's like. It really gives the hobby a much wider spread. And it's something that really astounded me when I was writing the portion for part one of this podcast. It turns out there's 40 million people worldwide who currently play D&D, and that's an absolute insane number. What do you guys think is really the appeal of D&D now? Because you're seeing a lot of people who wouldn't traditionally be considered role players taking this up.
I mean, I think nerd culture has come a long way. When I was a nerd, it was you get beaten up at school by the bullies, but nowadays, the geek have inherited the earth, right?
Yeah, but in the 1800s, Jason, that wasn't considered acceptable.
That's true, but I was out hunting my own dragons for sale. Jason's used dragon emporium.
Yeah, really shoddy dragons.
Yeah, the whole nerd culture. Would you buy a used dragon from this man? So yeah, I don't know. I think say nerd culture's come a long way. I think it's cool to be a nerd, or a lot cooler than it used to be. I think the prevalence of certain web shows like your Critical Role and stuff like that have done a massive amount of good for the hobby. I mean, it's been everywhere, hasn't it? It's been on TV, whether it's a little sideshow in ET or whether it's Big Bang Theory. They're always playing it. That helps.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Obviously, video games sort of kept the lights alive. Probably just more general interest in things like fantasy and computer games like World of Warcraft going mainstream. We won't get back into 4th edition, but ultimately, like 4th edition was probably like an answer to things like World of Warcraft. Getting people interested in fantasy games and it becoming such a mainstream thing to be interested in those types of games where, it was more niche before then. The streaming is a more recent thing, but like I look at like the video games, just a constant stream of those over the years, and they've been getting better and better and better. Obviously books, shelves and shelves of novels and books. More recently, the additional tools like D&D Beyond is an excellent tool and has made things more accessible than ever before. I mean, if you think about the digital capabilities of getting books now versus when we all had to go. If you think about being in the UK or the US, we think of it, it's just easy to go to like your local Waterstones or to Barnes & Noble and just pick up whatever book you like. But like the digital capabilities of not only being able to order in places like Amazon, but also being able to actually digitally get copies of books and not even have to cart around physical books. I mean, you think about 3rd edition, think about like the suitcase worth of books we all had to carry around if we wanted to bring all the things that all the options that you needed. Now it's an iPad. That means that opens up a lot of options to people to have as many things that make the game more accessible for them. Even digital character sheets, everything. It's something I'm super interested in. I could go on and on, but I'll pass I'll pass the mic. But there's a lot more to it than just the core book nowadays.
Yeah, I agree. And the tools do really help. And positive representation in the media. You know, boy, was D&D ever hamstrung, is that a word? Hamstringed? Hurt by all the negative press and the smart aleck, only jerks play that, or only the, socially impaired play those games sort of thing. We fought that for decades. And then only recently, in the past, I would say in the past decade, has that started to make a turn. There started to be a positive image of D&D and the enjoyment you can get out of it. I absolutely agree with Steve's point on video games. I think that opened up the fantasy worlds, playing a character in a fantasy world to a lot of people. And, again, and to Jason's point about nerd culture moving to the fore, the Lord of the Rings movies didn't hurt. And I think a bit of the improv culture, the idea that, we can improvise and act out a story. I think people playing video games quite often will feel railroaded. That, okay, I have this character, but I'm on this path that has been defined by a programmer that I have to follow. And the idea that I can have a character and I can, have a complete sandbox and go off in the direction I want to go and tell the story that I want to tell, I think that has appealed to a lot of people.
Yeah, the video game point's really interesting because, and again, I mentioned this in part one of the podcast, but there's an awful lot that the current video games industry owes to the role-playing hobby in terms of concepts like levels, experience, and whatnot, but also more fundamental ways in terms of how they're designed. If you look at most modern video games, they all have the tutorial level or levels where the player is taught the basics of the game by going through a set of easy missions, and the first thing you have to do is you have to press button A to do something, and then the next part you've got to press button A and B in combination, and so on and so forth until you kind of get what all the controls are. A lot of what you see in the likes of the new Dungeons and Dragons starter sets pretty much follows that, but it goes way further back. I remember the Red Box from 1983. It includes a solo adventure in the player's manual. It's the very first thing you get. And it's kind of crude and it's basic. And if you read it today, the format is kind of laughable. However, the principle of what it's doing is very, very solid. It's teaching you how to play the game through reading through this example. And in this case, you're wandering around some dungeon, you kill a few ghouls and you fight an evil wizard, but it lets you learn the basics of the game. And it's a fantastic way of getting new players into the hobby, and they've certainly taken that original concept and refined that with the really polished products that we see on the shelves nowadays.
In video game terms, they have a term for that. It's called scaffolding. In tabletop game design, they're encouraged to look at video games to show how well that works in video games, for helping people understand, oh, okay, these are how the rules work. This is how I do the things I want to do. And I think D&D 5 has picked up on that with better examples.
Yeah, I knew you'd be able to put that much better than I would. One of the things Steve mentioned was carrying around a suitcase full of books for version 3.5. And I think that's another reason there was a lot of residual anger about 4th edition, was a lot of people get very, very invested in 3rd edition, bought an absolute ton of supplements, and then a few years later they went, hey, we've got 4th edition. And the largest criticism, apart from the fact that it killed 3rd, was it felt a lot more like a tactical war game rather than D&D as people knew it and loved it. But one of the things that 3rd edition really benefited from was revisiting a lot of the settings that D&D had built up over the years. And it's one of the reasons I chose not to do a setting section of this podcast, was because there are simply so many D&D settings out there. Do you guys have a particularly favourite setting?
Got a couple I would like to mention, I guess. So the first alternative realm that I came across for D&D was Forgotten Realms. And that's kind of still exists. It's still there in 5th edition. It's a quite a heavily detailed came in a box when I first got it, and it had all these little cultural twists for your races and your classes, and even down to weapons and stuff like that. We mentioned in the previous podcast about little gnome hook hammers and Valinor double scimitars, and all these kind of little things that didn't make a huge amount of mechanical difference to the game, but added a lot of color. So I guess that was my first one. The one I think is probably my favorite is probably Eberron, which was a result of a competition. Came out in 3.5, and it was very much more kind of. It was like steampunk met film noir met D&D. So you'd have like these lightning rail trains, and you'd have these. The whole continent was emerging from a war, which gave you some good role-playing opportunities around, which side were you on, and what potential atrocities did your side commit, and history written by the victors and all that kind of stuff. They introduced a new race called the Warforged, who were like this artificial race that were constructed to do the fighting on behalf of one of the countries, and had since become kind of liberated and a playable race. And I guess that kind of artificial people aspect's always been a big thing of sort of mine, the kind of thing that I like. Whether it's kind of augmentation in terms of things like the cyberpunk genre, and I'm sure we'll get to that at some point, or whether it's like almost like Captain Nemo-esque or steampunk kind of artificial people like you've got in Guild Ball with the engineers, if you've ever played that game, where they're kind of wooden, animated, all brass and steam-powered potentially people, and I just thought it was quite interesting. It was a really good take on D&D and very different from what we kind of expected with the sort of swords and sorcery Conan the Barbarian style that kind of came before it.
There's so much there's been so much of a breadth of, like you mentioned, so many settings and things like that over the last 40-50 years of this game. I mean, definitely to echo Jason, Forgotten Realms clearly is probably going to be the canonical for a lot of people. I'm kind of sad because it's kind of what they're pretty much all in on that with 5th edition, and it kind of makes me sad that we've sort of lost things like Dragonlance, which to me was one of the quintessential settings and things I remember most fondly. Reading Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the original chronicles, but by Weiss and Hickman, those were just seminal novels that I read, and the entire setting was great, and it felt just enough different from your Forgotten Realms or your Greyhawk that just felt really good. Later on, I like how they pivoted to different settings, things like Dark Sun, which was completely different, and that they moved to just even things like Eberron, where you hadn't, there were still fantasy, even things like Spelljammer, where it was just completely off the wall, but that they experimented more back in the day. I feel like they've maybe playing a bit more safe and more commercialized these days with Forgotten Realms, as well as now they're doing, settings based on Magic the Gathering, which to me is, it is what it is. It's part of Wizards of the Coast's brands, and there's going to be a lot of people who really like that. To me, I just feel like it's a wasted opportunity from a nostalgia perspective. I love that they're doing tie-ins with Critical Role, but then I'm biased because I'm a huge fan, and we won't enough said about that one way or another. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot of fans who are probably really craving for some of the old school settings to come back.
Well, I'm just wildly jealous of the amount of playing that you guys were able to do while I was getting married and having kids and being away from the hobby. I would have loved to have had the depth in, I guess if I were to talk about which my favorite would be Forgotten Realms, but that's just about by default. And to be honest, the DMs that I had didn't focus much on the larger scale, and didn't focus much on the entire world of things. It didn't come up. We were living in the small little world that we had, and I don't think I very often got beyond level 12 while playing anything. So those the big decisions you'd make that where knowledge of the greater world made a big difference. I will do a shout out, or have a shout out to for Eberron. Keith Baker's actually a friend. I got to know him through the tabletop. We both have the same publisher. And boy, what a life he's had, where he is commissioned sometimes to go run a game of Eberron for people, like a corporate gig, basically. Wouldn't that be nice, right?
Oh yeah. Sign me up.
Yeah, right.
I'd just end up with people asking for their money back. It would be depressing for me.
Yeah. But anyway, just it's a beautiful world we live in now, right? But that said, my GMs, the DMs, I play so many non-D&D games that I tend to use GM more than DM, but the DMs I've had were focused very much more on the smaller local color than the larger intrigue of the entire world. And I didn't end up reading much of the associated fiction that went along with all this, so I didn't really form a strong bond to any of the other worlds.
I looked up for Planescape how many supplements had been released, and in our last episode, we talked about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and in the first part of the podcast, I basically talked about all the supplements that had ever been released, and I was able to do that in the scope of one podcast. For Planescape, which I think was one of the smaller supplements in terms of volume of releases, there was more stuff released for Planescape, one of the settings, than all of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay got its whole first edition. It's one of the reasons, again, I didn't bother doing a settings initial podcast, because there are just so many supplements that have been released for all these different settings. If you just take the big ones like Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, I mean, you are talking dozens of supplements there. I think the word prodigious springs to mind in terms of how well they churned out material for those. On that note, do you guys have any favourite modules that you ever played through? You know, those little 32-page and sometimes longer paperbacks that they used to release. Any ones that stand out for you?
I3 to I5, my friend. So this was by the same people who did the Dragonlance, Tracy and Hickman, or I can't remember, I'm sorry. But they weren't set in Dragonlance, but it was the Pharaoh Seas, Desert of Desolation, I think it got called in the end. And it was 3 linked modules all set in like a fictional Egypt, basically. So the first one module you have is called Pharaoh. You've got to go and get basically contacted by the ghost of a dead pharaoh who wants you to loot his tomb. And as part of that, you end up freeing a Freetie that's going to lay waste to everything. And then the subsequent modules follow along after that, and where you've got to you go and try and hunt down and free a djinn to fight Ifrit, and that goes horribly wrong. And then you end up sailing in ships across a sea of glass to a tomb of a wizard who's a real smart ass and kind of probably should have dealt with it before he died, and you had to resurrect him. Yeah, I remember playing those. They were the original AD&D as well, so they've stuck with me a long time. I think there was even a gnome in one of the modules who was there was some silly bits. There were some very silly bits you would not have approved, Iain. There was a gnome who was digging his way through the pyramid with a spoon. There were exploding pineapples, but also one of the best traps I think I came across, which was a pit trap, a traditional pit trap, but it had a teleport at the bottom and a portal at the top, so you fell forever. Which was, you just see the same things going past you all the time, and that was kind of cool. There was some good bits in it. It was like a time stop adventure in the last module as well. That was quite clever. Things you had to do because everything was frozen in time, so you couldn't open the doors and you couldn't go through a bead curtain because it was all sealed in time. And there was some real faffing around to do, but it was just nice and well thought out in a lot of ways. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but yeah, definitely had fun playing that one.
I'm not going to lie, I tried to think long and hard about any specific, and none came to mind of things that really stuck out because there were so many over the different editions. But what I would say is the things that the D&D, I'd call them artifacts or, adventures or stories that really came to mind most for me were more things that were along the PC games. Things like the Baldur's Gate stories, Neverwinter Nights, Eye of the Beholder, SSI games. Those kind of stuck out to me more just from a nostalgia memory perspective. I know those are not the modules per se, but it's more just like there were D&D stories, and being a computer game nerd as much as I am, they really struck a chord. And also the books, like obviously there've been a wealth of D&D stories over the years, and there's a variety of different novel sets that really, R.A. Salvatore series, as mentioned earlier, Dragonlance books. Those are the stories in D&D that really that always come back to mind for me, because they stick with you, and you don't have to go back and find a group to replay an adventure. You can just go back and even these days just go grab the PDF and read. They don't always reread as well as they do when you think about them when they were a kid, and that's not gonna lie. I tried to reread some of them recently, and they don't read as well as a grown adult as they did when you were a teenager or a kid, for sure.
Yeah, I found that the one that I looked up for this podcast, and I remember playing this but it was Keep on the Borderlands. That was B2. You sometimes get those introductions in games where they say, this is what a GM does. And you get the usual bit about you have to be the player's eyes and ears, blah, blah, blah. This is probably written, it's the most florid description that I've seen of what a GM does. It says, as DM, you are to become the shaper of the cosmos. It is you who will give form and content to all the universe. You will breathe life into stillness, giving meaning and purpose to all the actions which are to follow. The others in your group will assume the roles of individuals and play their parts, but each can only perform within the bounds you will set. It is now up to you to create a magical realm filled with danger, mystery, and excitement, complete with countless challenges. And you then get an adventure where I think you're beating up a bunch of kobolds.
No pressure, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I had a different kind of luxury, I'll say, and that is having some really fantastic GMs with very creative ideas about their own worlds. So, and some of the things that they brought to the game that I don't see in most modules, or didn't see until we started to get into the 3.5 era, was that people did things for reasons. We didn't have an evil wizard who was evil because he was evil. That he just hates people and wants everyone to die. We had people who did things for political reasons, or because they were seeking revenge, or for I'll say human reasons, even though in most cases they weren't humans, but they did things for reasons. And we didn't do a lot of dungeon crawls. And it's funny, I've developed a bit of an aversion or distaste for these massive, just crazy maze dungeons. Sigourney Weaver's character in Galaxy Quest. Okay, so think about that. Galaxy Quest, remember? And they're trying to get to the core, and there's this big, big slamming things all around. And it's just her reaction to all it is much my reaction to these maze adventures. Who builds these things? What logical sense does any of this make? Why would you do this? And I understand a big part of the game is suppressing those ideas and just saying, okay, look, it's a fantasy world. People do things for fantasy reasons. And there's just plain evil in the world, and some evil people do things this way. I haven't developed a good ability to just suppress things that much. I'm going to ask, why would you do this? What sense does it make to make a really dangerous trap in a hallway that everybody walks through every day? Those sorts of things. These things occur to me, right? So anyway, I realize your question is about the modules. In some cases, I'm kind of glad I didn't play a lot of the modules because I didn't spend too much time griping about those things.
I'm inclined to agree with you. It was one of the reasons that I always found Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay more appealing than D&D, and that was for the motivation side of things. To prove that I'm not a filthy promise breaker, Steve mentioned last episode that I should run the Enemy Within campaign because he'd never played in it. Steve, what am I running for you at the moment?
A podcast. No. Yes, we just started. We did our first session of the Enemy Within last week. I'm really excited about it.
And one of the great things about that is that the various quote-unquote villains you come across all have very human motivations for doing things, whereas in a lot of D&D modules, the villains are static things that happen to be there and you have to bypass. One of the most famous, or maybe infamous is the term, modules ever written for D&D was Tomb of Horrors. I think it was module S1, S standing for special. And it was one that Gary Gygax wrote because I think he wanted to run a convention or something along those lines, but basically challenge people who claimed that they had amazing characters and they could overcome all sorts of trials and tribulations. But it's essentially a very well-constructed dungeon, but there's traps and there's monsters and there's puzzles to figure out. But it's very much in the mold of this thing is here for you to overcome, rather than there being much in the way of a rhyme or reason for why it's being there in the first place. And I think that probably speaks to two very different styles of play. To me, role-playing is you have this character, you're effectively living their life, and at the risk of sounding like some sort of pretentious melodramatic actor, whenever I play a game, I want my character to have a motivation for doing something. Whereas I think the classic dungeon crawl is much more akin to a video game where you've got to accept that your motivation is to go down there, kick in the doors, grab as much treasure as you can, and then get out of there before you die horribly. And I think you see that in a lot of the earlier ones where it's a lot more accepting for GMs to have players die. And it almost feels that they've been set up to test the players in that respect.
I certainly think that's true of the sort of very early stuff. But I think, as things have developed, that people expect a bit more these days in terms of, as you say, motivations of the bad guys and the not quite so cookie-cutter, two-dimensional kind of. While I think your statement is true of the early days, I think it's come a long way since then. Tomb of Horrors would actually go down as probably my least favourite model ever.
Yeah, it's horrible.
But it was designed to be. It was specifically there as almost like how far can you get in a certain amount of time. Don't run it for any players you care about. It's specifically designed to kill you in as many interesting ways as it possibly can. But yeah, you're right. Things have changed, and people expect an awful lot more. That's one of the reasons I really like the Eberron setting. Is it seemed a lot more morally grey, a lot more morally ambiguous. So, and I guess that comes from the slightly noir-esque kind of aspects of it. So,
and it's because you're a recovering goth. That's why.
Yeah, two podcasts in a row have mentioned that. People start talking.
I think also something else that reflects that is the de-emphasis of alignment in 5. Alignment's just kind of a thing you have. It's either you have freckles or you don't, but it doesn't really play into. The detect good and evil spells are still there, but where in the past it seemed, it was one of the first topics brought up. It was like in chapter 1, your character is going to have this type of alignment, and if you have this alignment, you can't be one of these. And now that's very much back burner because I think our tastes in media and our tastes in what we want to experience, we appreciate the gray. We appreciate the nuance. Things aren't cookie cutter and black and white anymore.
I think that's very true. I remember the old edition, you had alignment languages that you could speak a special language that only other good people could speak and evil people could speak an evil language, which just seems absolutely absurd. And a lot of the older alignment stuff seems very, very much tacked on. It was almost like people didn't, I think it probably came out of the fact that people didn't really know what role-playing was, and it was a tool to make role-playing easier for people to say, okay, your guy's a good guy, he'll probably do these things. Whereas nowadays, as you say, I think people have a much, fondness is maybe not the word, but a much better grasp of moral shades of grey. If you look at, for example, superhero genre, a lot of the more interesting characters are the ones that have those shades of grey, where they're not, Captain America good or Superman good or Lex Luthor evil. It's the ones that have a moral ambiguity about them, which I think is missing in a lot of early D&D. Those goblins were just evil because it said so on page blah blah blah. Now, one thing that everyone has in D&D is a favourite class and or race, or if you're playing basic, your race is your class as well. Do you guys have any particular favourite that stands out? Is there anything that's your go-to every single time you play?
So I always gravitated to human. Not because they were boring, just from a flexibility perspective. They didn't have any major disadvantages other than, the old night vision always kind of burns you. But a combination of a human and a ranger. Ranger has always, I've always been fascinated by, kind of like that hunter kind of character, especially the dual wielding option that you have with that. I was never really the Legolas bow guy, but the dual wielding dervish type character always kind of pulled me in. I tend to gravitate towards that whenever I'm trying a new character for the first time in a system.
And what minimax monstrosity did you like, Jason?
Wow. Because the obvious answer to that would be elves, right? Because anything you can do, an elf can do better. I don't know. So I've played it for so long. I would say generally a wizard of some description, but I've played for so long. I'm now find myself just like, what does the party need, or what fits best with what we're trying to do? So latest game that's kind of started up a little while ago, I let everybody else was discussing characters and exchanging emails, and I was like, well, tell you what, guys, I'll just sit back and we'll find out what we need. And invariably that ends up being the kind of cleric. Can't be a bit of religious zealotry when you're role playing. That's the one thing I would say. As you well know, my war machine kind of men off past, present. Gives you a lot of role-playing options, and the other great thing about playing a religious guy in like D&D is, there's no ambiguity. Everybody believes. There's no atheists, right? Because if you're an atheist and I'm going to cure wounds or stop your disease or remove that curse, you're going to believe. It's just the case of it. So, yeah, I kind of magic is a big factor. I like to play a character who's got magic, as I said before about being the kind of party's Batman by being the wizard. So, you've got all the utility spells that make people climb walls or have a little extra dimensional hut in which you can take a rest without getting molested by wandering monsters and things like that. So spells, and more spells.
I'm going to split the difference between Jason and Steve and say half-elf. I do. I've always just kind of enjoyed them. A little bit of foot in both worlds sort of thing. And if I wasn't doing half elf, I'd probably lean more toward elf. But I like the Dexy types. But I've always wanted a good, effective, interesting ranger, and I would be more the Legolas type than the dual wielder. But it's in so many of the versions, the ranger is just impaired. A fighter with a bow is going to be always more interesting, I think, than most rangers. I do like a bit of magic. If I were to talk about favorite class, it was a short-lived class in 3.5 called a factotum, and so there would be some knowing nods on that one. The factotum was a character who could start each day and say, you know what, I'm feeling kind of ranger today, or I'm feeling kind of roguish today, or whatever. And they could move their stats around slightly, and they could basically gain some abilities for that day that would be more what the party needed. It's kind of really a jack of all trades. They'd have a limited number of uses of everything, but in a pinch, they were pretty interesting. It was a multi-tool type of role, and I really liked it. I also like the skill-heavy, knowledge-heavy roles to just kind of be the okay, well, what does so and so think? And they turn to me and ask my opinion on things. Know it all without acting like a know-it-all. Yeah.
I always ended up basically just playing a human fighter, and I think it comes from the very first time I played, and I said, what would be easiest to learn? And the guy was like, yeah, be a human fighter. There's not a lot that you have to learn. And I think I just stuck ever since. I think I was just too lazy to learn what all those spells did, or how to go around healing people. Is there anything you guys categorically wouldn't want to play? I know Jason said that he's very easygoing and will play whatever the party finds most useful. But is there anything that you just think, oh no, I don't want to be that?
As a rule, a cleric. That just does nothing for me. It was Jason, I think, made a good point that there are no atheists in D&D, and if they are, they're delusional, because there is evidence, right? But that just I don't know. It's not the way I prefer to play. Other than that, I'm not a paladin. I know there are better ways of playing paladins, but they always just seem to be buzzkill.
From a cleric perspective, actually, you mentioned cleric, because I would, just to answer the question, I'd say I pretty much would go with Jason these days. Is I from a flexibility and kind of chill perspective, I really just want to let other people kind of pick the classes I like, because I like to get a new experience. But from a cleric perspective, the domain system in 5e I will bring up as an opportunity to tune a cleric to be able to still be the healer of the party, but have a lot more flexibility and to have more flavor than your old school generic cleric. I just played in my most recent game, I played a war domain cleric, and I believe the phrase murder cleric was thrown around about my character, because I was always charging into combat, getting flanking with someone and doing crazy amounts of damage. And at low levels, that's possible with that type of cleric. It evens out later on. You become more of the healer, stand back type, because you just can't keep up with the fighters. But like at low levels, it's a lot of fun to play a war cleric. it's definitely good times. But yeah, I'll play whatever. I like to have a variety and learn new things. And I will say about human as well, something I find about the benefit of human is I can see through a human's eyes and grok the world a lot easier than I can through one of the non-humans if I'm trying to learn the setting. And that makes a lot less stress for me trying to like learn a new game or a new setting if I can at least have a closer empathy with the race I'm playing.
Listen, gents, thank you very much for your time. We could probably talk about this for hours, but sadly, I would be put to death by my wife if I took that opportunity. Before we finish, one of the things I was going to ask is, did any of you have any shout outs to either any projects you're doing or anything you'd recommend, any podcasts, YouTube, anything that you think our listenership would be interested in?
I don't take in much of the other media. I do still catch Critical Role. I think that I've never seen as good an effective DM as Matt Mercer, but that's kind of like saying McDonald's is a restaurant you should try sometime. It's like, okay, everybody does that, and you got that. So I don't feel like there's a big endorsement there. I will second a point to the D&D Beyond. I'm very impressed with D&D Beyond and how they have embraced the tabletop part of it, made digital what makes sense to be made digital without trying to force you to use your computer to play during every session. It just struck a really great balance, and their platform works really well.
Another thing I'll chime in real quick about, just to echo Critical Role, but also just people should start, I think, if they have time and the desire to check out Twitch and to check out the variety of different role-playing live stream, if for no other reason than it exposes a whole new sort of world of content for people, and it's no longer stigmatized. There's just so many of them. Critical Role is the highest profile, but there's so many really solid groups playing on Twitch, and it's an interesting experience to delve into those communities and just learn more about different angles and different way people play. So highly recommend it.
Not to really kind of shout out to anything, but just to kind of, there's a lot of us about, and we've all got real lives. We're all far too old, and it's hard to get a group together these days. So a group of mine have been using Fantasy Grounds for D&D. Great old product. I think the DM has paid for it, but most of us can use it for free, and we can play entire games of D&D online. And sometimes that's an awful lot easier than getting people around a table. It's no substitute. I hardly recommend face-to-face as the priority, but if you can't do it, it's not a bad shout.
I'm going to mention a couple of things that have come to my attention. In our last section of the podcast, I kind of dedicated it to Dave Arneson, because Gary Gygax often gets the credit for D&D, and it was really built off the back of a lot of work that Dave Arneson did before him. However, I was contacted on Twitter by a fella who uses the Twitter handle at Blackmoor_film. I'll put all these in the show notes, incidentally. But he actually produced a short film called Secrets of Blackmoor, which is available on Vimeo, and it talks about the whole background to what led to what we know as D&D nowadays. I actually rented it, watched it, and it's absolutely fascinating. I think it took a lot of time to make. It's very polished, it's very professional. It's definitely worth a watch, because it really highlights the history of the hobby from its Napoleonic wargaming roots to what it is nowadays. The other thing that I want to give a shout out to is, we talked earlier about the difference between role-playing, R-O-L-E, and role-playing, R-O-L-L, where the latter is much more, you have a dungeon there, you're going to explore it, you're going to kill things, you're going to take the treasure, and at the end, that's it, that's what you've done. There's a product out there called Old School Essentials, produced by a company called Necrotic Gnome. They're at Necrotic Gnome on Twitter, which is essentially the 1981 basic D&D, but polished up and reworked for the modern day. And it makes no pretenses about what it is. It's there for you to design dungeons, which you and your friends can go and explore, and you can bring back all the treasure, you can kill the evil monsters and level up. And in this day and age of video games, where that's essentially what you do, it's an absolutely excellent way of getting people into the hobby, but it's also a very good product for people who want to scratch that itch, that they're not really particularly interested in melodrama and character development and being last of a dying race. They just want to kick doors down and kill orcs. It's a very, very good product for that. So I heartily recommend people taking a look at that. The final thing I'm going to recommend, since we have a world-famous games designer on the podcast, is a board game called Gravwell, which Corey here designed and published. Do you want to give us the 2-minute elevator pitch about Gravwell, Corey?
Sure. It was published by Renegade Games. It's available. You can get it on Amazon and all over. But it's called Gravwell, Gravwell. It's short for gravitational well. It is a light filler game. It is the game, I designed it to be the game you played while you're waiting for everybody else to show up to play the real game. In it, you are captaining a ship represented by a pawn on a linear track and a spiral track. You're trying to escape from the center and work your way out to the end of the spiral where there's a warp gate before it closes. The trick is your engines don't work, but your tractor beams do. So you will propel yourself forward by using your tractor beams to attract yourself toward the ship. That's, you slingshot past each other. The trick is your tractor beams lock onto whichever ship is closest to you. So if the closest ship to you is behind you, you're going to move backwards instead of forwards. Each round you play a card. The card indicates how far you'll go, and it also indicates the order in which you'll play. And if you are just ahead of somebody else, you'll want to play a card that will play later in the round to give them a chance to pass you before you attract yourself to them. It's a bunch of slingshotty, second-guessing fun, and it plays in about 20 minutes. It's won some awards. It was published in 2013, and anyway, there's a new version coming out. I can't get into much of the details of it, but a lot of people ask for right now. The current version only supports 4 players. The new version will support 6 players. So people were asking for that, and then now there'll be some individual ship powers. So each player will have a unique ship that can do things that the other ships can't. So looking forward to that. It won't be in 2020, but it'll be probably in 2021. So.
As someone who's played Gravwell, I can heartily recommend it. It's a lot of fun, and as Corey says, it plays in about 20 minutes, which is an absolutely fantastic level of time for any board game when you don't have the time to sit and set up Arkham Horror and play for 12 hours or however long that usually takes. So thanks very much, gents. Pleasure having you on the podcast. Hopefully we'll see you again next time.
Cheers,
Thanks
Iain.
so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank goodness that's done.
And that was our D&D Roundtable. I'd like to take the time again to thank Jason, Steve and Corey for joining us. We're a podcast about old school role-playing games, and if you enjoyed this episode, please get in touch with us on Twitter at SavePodcast or email us at roll.to.save.pod@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for Roll to Save. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to leave us a review on your podcast directory of choice. We really appreciate them, and it helps with visibility. Thanks again for listening.